Hello everyone, welcome back to the Diplomacy course. We will continue with Chapter 5, Instruments and Institutions of Modern Diplomacy. In this chapter, we will firstly talk about origins and evolution of modern diplomacy, then instruments of modern diplomacy, and lastly, institutions of modern diplomacy. Let's start with origins and evolution of modern diplomacy. Origins of modern diplomacy date back to Italian city-states in the 14th century. The basic reason for the need to establish diplomatic relations between Italian city-states was the limited amount of lands to rule. Therefore, they had to solve their problems peacefully in such an environment prone to warfare. As armies became more professional and impact of war on these states got more severe, they had to find alternative ways to solve their problems without going into war. Moreover, the lack of outside pressure on the Italian peninsula and the freedom of states to conduct closer relations resulted in the formation of modern diplomacy with its institutions and instruments. Besides Renaissance in the 14th century, Reformation, which spread around Europe from Germany after the 15th century, played an important role in the formation of modern diplomacy because it accelerated the secularization of regimes and the formation of modern states in today's understanding. Similarly, Westphalia Treaty in 1648, which ended religious wars in Europe, became a turning point in the formation of modern states and the evolution of modern diplomacy. World War I was the first global mass mobilization and warfare in world history. More than 10 million people died and got wounded throughout the world, and the necessity to establish a stable and long-lasting diplomatic system came to the fore. After this brutal war, League of Nations was formed in 1919 to protect world peace and security as well as to solve interstate problems through diplomatic channels. Let's move on to the instruments of modern diplomacy. Modern diplomacy is conducted through three main instruments: bilateral diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy, and summit diplomacy. These instruments have evolved throughout history, so their dynamics have changed. More importantly, these instruments are not mutually exclusive. In other words, two or three of them can be utilized together. Bilateral diplomacy is the oldest form of diplomatic practice consisting of two states meeting to solve their problems. Its origins date back to ancient Greece, but after the 14th century, it was professionalized by the Italian city-states. Bilateral diplomacy is conducted between two states, but initially these two states have to recognize each other to establish diplomatic missions and carry out diplomatic practice. Multilateral diplomacy is literally defined as diplomatic relations between more than two states. It is also known as conference diplomacy or parliamentary diplomacy because multilateral diplomatic relations are mainly conducted through conferences and face-to-face interaction between leaders or missions of states. Its origins go back to Vienna Congress, convened in 1815 after Napoleonic Wars, when European powers came up with the idea of balance of power strategy, which sustained peace in Europe until World War I. There are many advantages of multilateral conferences, like focusing on specific issues and motivating the parties to find a solution to reach an agreement in a limited period of time. Summit diplomacy traces back to Middle Ages, when the territories of monarchs were regarded as their own properties. In order to solve their problems or develop their relations, monarchs were meeting regularly. With the formation of modern nation-states, the decline of monarchies, and the establishment of modern diplomatic missions, diplomatic practices began to be carried out by professionals. However, World War I was a turning point in the rise of summit diplomacy. Summit diplomacy has some advantages and disadvantages. They have symbolic power as the meeting of heads of states, which enable them to use these summits as their propaganda tools to maximize the interests of their states. On the other hand, presidents or prime ministers are ultimate authorities in the decision-making mechanism, so revision of their decisions in summits are difficult to change. The lack of a changing mechanism for their decisions is a problem because generally leaders don't know the details of policies. We can continue with institutions of modern diplomacy. States are still major actors of diplomacy despite erosion of their jurisdiction as a result of globalization. In addition, they established two main institutions to carry out their diplomatic activities: Ministry of Foreign Affairs and diplomatic missions working under the control of these ministerial structures. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the main body in the state apparatus responsible for the formulation and implementation of foreign policy. It consists of the ministerial structure and diplomatic missions. The first Ministry of Foreign Affairs in today's understanding was established in France in the 1620s by Cardinal Richelieu, after 3 centuries from the establishment of modern diplomatic missions. Today, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is mainly responsible for the coordination of foreign policy rather than formulation and implementation of foreign policy only by itself. However, Ministry of Foreign Affairs still plays an important role in the implementation of foreign policy because it is the main body in the state apparatus having such experience and professional staff in foreign policy issues. Diplomatic missions are the main components of diplomacy acting on behalf of their state in the state they are accredited to. Origins of diplomatic missions go back to ad hoc diplomacy period, in which states were conducting foreign relations through temporary missions and envoys rather than establishing resident embassies. Ad hoc diplomacy was replaced by permanent diplomacy and its instruments and institutions as modern states began to form, especially after the 14th century, starting with Italy. Functions of diplomatic missions evolved in time as dynamics, instruments, and institutions of diplomacy changed. Today, there are different levels of diplomatic representation, and diplomatic missions have several functions and immunities. Functions of diplomatic missions are defined in the 3rd article of Vienna Convention. Duties specified in the convention are similar to the functions of envoys or agents of ad hoc diplomacy. However, as international relations diversified, functions of diplomatic missions got more complex. So, this is the end of our program for Chapter 5 of the Diplomacy course. Goodbye and see you in our next program, Chapter 6.